Have you ever been standing at a truck stop listening to the deep, rolling idle of a big diesel and found yourself wondering about the engines that are no longer there? Because if you spent any time around trucks in the 1980s, the 1990s, or the early 2000s, there is one name that comes up again and again in conversations between drivers who get a little quieter and a little more nostalgic when they say it. That name is Caterpillar, and specifically the engine that lived inside the legend, the Cat C-15, the 3406. The engines that drivers did not just respect, but genuinely loved in a way that people rarely love a piece of industrial machinery. And then in 2010, Caterpillar walked away. One of the most recognized and respected names in heavy equipment on the entire planet, a company that builds the machines that build the world, looked at the North American highway truck engine market and decided it was done. No dramatic announcement, no farewell tour, just a quiet, deliberate exit from an industry it had helped define for decades. So what happened? How does a company that dominant, that trusted, that deeply embedded in the culture of American trucking simply stop making truck engines? Was it a business failure, a regulatory defeat, a strategic retreat, or something more complicated than any single explanation can cover? The answer, as it turns out, is all of those things layered on top of each other, and it involves government regulations, billions of dollars in legal battles, engineering gambles that did not pay off, and a hard-nosed business calculation that Caterpillar made and has never publicly walked back. Stick around, because this is one of the most fascinating stories in the history of trucking, and by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the sound of a Cat engine on the highway became a memory instead of a constant. First, let us understand what Caterpillar actually meant to trucking. Before we get into why Cat left, we need to understand what it meant when Cat was there. Because without that context, the departure does not carry the weight it deserves. Caterpillar did not stumble into the truck engine business. They built their reputation over decades of producing engines for construction equipment, mining machines, marine applications, and power generation, environments where reliability is not a preference but an absolute requirement. A Cat engine in an excavator or a generator set has to work. Not most of the time, all of the time, under brutal conditions far from any service facility with everything depending on it running. That reputation transferred directly to highway trucking. When a fleet manager in the 1990s spec'd a Cat engine into a truck, they were buying that reputation. The reliability, the parts availability. The dealer network that stretched across the country. The resale value that a Cat-powered truck commanded over competitors. Drivers who ran Cat engines talked about them the way musicians talk about instruments they have bonded with. Not just tools. Companions, the 3406E and later the C-15 and C-16, became the benchmark engines of their era. The 3406E in particular is still talked about in trucking circles today as one of the finest diesel engines ever fitted to a highway truck. Simple enough to be worked on by a skilled, independent mechanic. Durable enough to go a million miles with proper maintenance, powerful enough to satisfy even the most demanding applications, and tunable in ways that the aftermarket embraced enthusiastically to produce power figures that made other manufacturers nervous. At the peak of Cat's involvement in the highway truck market, their engines powered a significant percentage of the heavy trucks rolling across North America. Kenworth and Peterbilt in particular had strong relationships with Caterpillar, and a Cat-powered W900 or 379 was considered by many in the industry to be the gold standard of the long-haul truck. This was not a niche player, this was a dominant force, which makes what happened next all the more remarkable. The regulatory storm that changed everything. To understand why Caterpillar ultimately left, You have to understand what the Environmental Protection Agency was doing to the diesel engine industry in the late 1990s and early 2000s, because the EPA did not just raise the bar for emissions. They fundamentally changed the game in a way that put every engine manufacturer under enormous pressure, and Caterpillar responded to that pressure in a way that set them on a collision course with regulators that would cost them everything. In 1998, the EPA tightened emission standards for heavy-duty diesel engines, focusing primarily on nitrogen oxide emissions, which are a significant contributor to smog and respiratory health problems. The new standards required meaningful reductions in NOx output, and they required them on a timeline that the engine manufacturers found extremely challenging. The industry's response was to develop what became known as cooled exhaust gas recirculation, or EGR. The concept is exactly what it sounds like. Take a portion of the exhaust gas, cool it, and recirculate it back into the combustion chamber. The cooler, oxygen-depleted exhaust gas lowers combustion temperatures, and lower combustion temperatures produce less NOx. It worked. It met the standards, and most manufacturers adopted it. Caterpillar did not. Instead, CAT developed their own proprietary approach called ASSERT, Advanced Combustion Emissions Reduction Technology. The idea was to achieve the same emissions reductions through a different method, primarily through managing the combustion process itself rather than recirculating exhaust gases. CAT believed and invested heavily in the belief that ASSERT was a superior approach technically, cleaner combustion rather than diluted combustion in simplified terms. The problem was that ASSERT in its early implementations did not perform as well as the EGR systems that competitors were fitting. Drivers and fleet operators reported that the ASSERT-equipped engines were not delivering the fuel efficiency and reliability that CAT engines had always been known for. The power was still there. The durability, at least initially, seemed acceptable, but the fuel economy numbers, which for a fleet operator running hundreds of trucks across millions of miles is the number that matters most, were not where they needed to be. And then the legal situation exploded. The consent decree and the billion-dollar penalty. Here's where the story takes a turn that most people outside the industry do not know about, but which is absolutely central to understanding why Caterpillar eventually walked away. In 1998, the same year the EPA tightened its emission standards, a separate investigation was underway into the practices of the major diesel engine manufacturers, including Caterpillar. The EPA and the Department of Justice alleged that multiple manufacturers had been using what were called defeat devices, software programming that allowed engines to meet emission standards during certification testing, but operate differently, producing more NOx during normal on-road driving conditions. The allegation in plain language was that the engines were cheating on their emissions tests, and the EPA had the data to support it. Caterpillar, along with Cummins, Detroit Diesel, Volvo, Mack, Navistar, and Renault, settled with the government in a consent decree that cost the industry a total of around $1 billion in penalties and required the manufacturers to fund clean diesel programs and accelerate their compliance timelines. Caterpillar's portion of that settlement was significant. This was not just a financial blow. It was a reputational blow to a company whose entire brand identity was built around engineering integrity. Caterpillar had built their name on the idea that their machines did what they said they did all the time, under any conditions. A consent decree involving emissions manipulation was exactly the kind of story that cut against that identity at its foundation. The consent decree also came with a requirement to meet stricter emissions standards ahead of the originally planned timeline, which put CAT's ASSERT development program under even more pressure. They were now racing to prove a technology that was already under scrutiny, under a tighter deadline, with a damaged reputation to repair. The 2007 regulations, the wall CAT could not climb. If 1998 was difficult, 2007 was where the story reached its breaking point. The EPA's 2007 emissions standards for heavy-duty highway engines were a genuine step change, not an incremental tightening, but a fundamental shift in what was required. The new standards cut allowable NOx emissions by approximately 90% compared to 2004 levels, 90%, and they added strict limits on particulate matter at the same time. Meeting these standards required not just better combustion technology, but an entirely new approach to exhaust after-treatment. The industry's answer was diesel particulate filters, or DPFs, to catch particulate matter, combined with selective catalytic reduction, or SCR, which uses a urea-based solution called diesel exhaust fluid to chemically convert NOx into harmless nitrogen and water. The addition of DPF and SCR systems added cost, added weight, added complexity, and added a maintenance requirement that drivers and fleet operators were not thrilled about. The diesel exhaust fluid tanks needed to be refilled regularly, the particulate filters needed to be regenerated, and the overall system added failure points that experienced mechanics found frustrating. But here's the critical thing. The 2007 standards were not optional. Every engine manufacturer selling highway truck engines in the United States had to comply. Cummins complied, Detroit Diesel complied, Volvo complied, Paccar complied with their MX engines, and Caterpillar. Caterpillar looked at the cost of developing a fully compliant engine family, weighed it against the returns they were seeing from the highway truck engine market, and started doing some very hard math. The business calculation that ended it. This is the part of the story that is hardest to find in the headlines, but most important to understand. Because Caterpillar's exit from the highway truck engine market was not at its core a technical failure. It was a business decision. A cold, calculated, strategic business decision made by a company that looked at the numbers and concluded that the highway truck engine market was not worth what it was going to cost to stay in it. Think about Caterpillar's broader business. They make engines for mining equipment that sells for millions of dollars per unit. They make engines for marine applications, for oil and gas, for power generation, for construction equipment deployed on projects worth billions. These are markets where the customer is typically a large corporation, where the margins are strong, where the relationship between manufacturer and customer is long-term and deep, and where Caterpillar's particular strengths in durability and reliability command premium pricing without much resistance. The highway truck engine market is different. The customers are fleet operators and owner-operators who are acutely, even aggressively, price-sensitive. The margins are thinner. The competition is intense. Cummins, Detroit Diesel, and the truck manufacturers' in-house engine options were all fighting hard for the same business. And the cost of developing a fully 2010 compliant engine family with all the engineering work, the testing, the tooling, the after-treatment system development, and the dealer network training that would require was going to run into the billions of dollars. Caterpillar ran the numbers. The projected return on that investment in a competitive market with thin margins and an uncertain regulatory future that showed no signs of becoming less demanding, did not justify the cost. Not when there were other markets where the same engineering resources could generate better returns with less regulatory risk. In 2008, Caterpillar announced that they would stop selling on highway truck engines after the 2010 model year. And that was that. No dramatic collapse, no bankruptcy, no engineering crisis that forced their hand. A profitable, healthy, globally dominant company simply decided that this particular market was not worth fighting for on the terms being set. It was in a strange way one of the most honest corporate decisions in the industry's recent history. They did not pretend they could not do it. They concluded they should not do it, and they left, what drivers lost and what they never got back. Now let us talk about what actually disappeared when Caterpillar walked out of the highway market, because the business analysis only tells half the story. The other half is the human one. Drivers who had run Cat engines for years or decades faced a decision they had not expected to make. The engines in their current trucks would continue to be supported, at least for a while. Parts would remain available. The service network would not vanish overnight, but the next truck would not have a Cat option. The engine that many of them had built their entire professional preference around was simply no longer available as a new purchase. For some drivers, this was a practical inconvenience. They evaluated Cummins, they evaluated Detroit, they made a choice and moved on. Trucking is an industry of pragmatists, and pragmatists adapt. But for a certain generation of drivers, the ones who had learned their trade behind a 3406 or a C15, who had developed an intimate understanding of how those engines sounded, how they responded, how they behaved in mountain grades, and on long, flat interstate runs. And in the cold mornings of a northern winter, the departure of Cat was something genuinely felt, the kind of loss that is hard to explain to someone who has not experienced it, but completely obvious to someone who has. There is a community of drivers and mechanics that exists to this day around the older Cat engines, particularly the pre-emissions 3406E and early C15. Trucks powered by those engines are maintained with unusual care, traded with unusual premiums, and discussed online with unusual passion for machines that have been out of production for years. When drivers post about their pre-emissions Cat with 1,000,000 miles on the clock that still runs strong, the comments fill up with people who understand exactly what they are talking about. That kind of loyalty does not happen for equipment that was merely good. It happens for equipment that was exceptional in a way people carry with them. The competitive landscape Cat left behind. When Caterpillar exited, the highway truck engine market reorganized around the players who remained, and the biggest beneficiary of Cat's departure was Cummins, who absorbed a significant portion of the customers who had previously specified Cat engines. Cummins had their own battles with the 2007 and 2010 emissions regulations, but they committed to solving them and built a compliant engine family that, over time, earned the kind of trust that Cat had previously commanded. The ISX and later the X-15 became the engines that filled the space Cat had left, not perfectly, not immediately, but effectively enough over time. Detroit Diesel, owned by Daimler and therefore connected to the Mercedes-Benz truck engineering ecosystem, also benefited particularly within the Freightliner customer base where Detroit engines had always had a strong home. The DD15 and DD16 became serious engines in their own right, and Detroit's integrated approach, where the engine manufacturer and the truck manufacturer are the same company, proved to be a competitive advantage in ways that became clearer over time. PACCAR, the parent company of Kenworth and Peterbilt, which had relied heavily on Cat engines for their premium trucks, responded to Cat's exit by accelerating development of their own engine program. The PACCAR MX engine, developed in partnership with DAF in Europe, became the in-house option that Kenworth and Peterbilt could offer as a replacement for the Cat specification. It took time to build the same level of driver trust that Cat had earned over decades, but PACCAR invested heavily in making it happen. The truck manufacturers who had built strong identities around the Caterpillar partnership had to rebuild parts of their brand story without one of its central chapters. A Kenworth W900 with a cat under the hood was a specific thing, a specific combination that meant something to the people who drove it. That combination no longer exists on a new truck, and the absence is felt even now. Could Cat come back? This is the question that comes up every few years, usually when emissions regulations shift or when the trucking industry goes through a major technology transition, and it is worth addressing directly because it is genuinely interesting. Caterpillar has never completely closed the door in public statements. They have maintained their engine engineering capabilities for their other markets. They continue to produce large diesel engines for mining, marine, power generation, and other industrial applications. The knowledge and the infrastructure have not disappeared, but the barriers to re-entry into the highway truck engine market have only grown since 2010. The regulatory environment has continued to tighten, with the EPA pushing toward near-zero emission standards for heavy trucks in the coming decade. The industry is moving toward alternative powertrains, hydrogen fuel cells, battery electric trucks, alternative fuels in ways that make the investment calculus for a new diesel highway engine program even more complicated than it was in 2008. If Caterpillar were to re-enter, it would almost certainly not be with a diesel engine in the traditional sense. It might be with a hydrogen combustion engine, a technology they are actively developing for other applications. It might be with a fuel cell system, it might be with something that does not exist in production form yet. But a straight diesel highway engine program built to 2024 standards from a standing start would require years of development and billions of dollars aimed at a market that is itself in transition. The honest assessment is that a traditional Cat diesel return is unlikely. A Cat presence in the future of truck propulsion, in whatever form that takes, is not impossible. And for the drivers who still talk about their old C15 with genuine reverence, even an unlikely possibility is better than none. The lesson that lasts. So why did Caterpillar quit producing highway truck engines? The real answer is that it was never just one thing. It was the accumulated weight of regulatory pressure and the cost of compliance. It was the damage of the consent decree and what it did to the company's relationship with regulators and its own reputation. It was the underperformance of the Assert technology at a critical moment when trust needed to be rebuilt rather than questioned. It was the thin margins of a competitive market measured against the better returns available elsewhere. And it was a hard-nosed corporate decision made by people who looked at all of those factors together and concluded that the right move was to walk away while the company was still strong enough to do so on its own terms. None of those factors alone would have been enough. Together, they created a conclusion that Caterpillar reached before most people in the industry saw it coming and acted on with a decisiveness that surprised even longtime observers of the company. Here is something that does not get talked about enough when people discuss Caterpillar's exit: the psychological impact it had on the truck buying process itself, because for years after 2010, walking into a Kenworth or Peterbilt dealership and speccing out a new truck felt subtly different to a generation of buyers who had always assumed Cat would be an option on the order sheet. It is a bit like walking into your favorite restaurant and discovering that the dish you always ordered, the one you have been ordering for 15 years without even looking at the menu, has been quietly removed. Everything else is still there. The place still looks the same, the service is still good, but something that was always part of how you experienced that place is simply gone, and the menu feels slightly incomplete no matter how good everything else on it is. Fleet managers who had built their entire maintenance programs around Cat engines had to retrain mechanics, renegotiate parts contracts, and rebuild institutional knowledge around different platforms. That transition cost real money and real time, and it happened at a moment when the industry was already dealing with the operational disruptions of adapting to the 2010 emissions equipment. It was change on top of change, and the people managing large fleets felt it acutely. Owner-operators felt it differently, but just as deeply for a solo driver who had saved for years to buy their own truck and had always pictured that truck with a Cat engine under the hood. The realization that the new version of that dream was no longer available was genuinely deflating. They adapted. They found engines they respected and eventually trusted, but the first truck they bought without a Cat option available was a different kind of purchase than the ones that came before it, and the dealerships themselves quietly lost something too. The Cat engine specification had been a selling point, a differentiator, a reason that certain buyers walked through certain doors. Kenworth dealers who had built reputations as the place to go for a serious Cat-powered truck had to rebuild that conversation around different strengths. Some did it seamlessly, some found it harder than they expected. Because replacing a legend in a sales conversation is not as straightforward as replacing a part number in a catalog. The exit left a gap that was filled eventually, but never quite the same way. And the lesson here is one that comes up again and again when you look at how industries change and how dominant players exit markets they once owned. Winning a market and staying in a market are two different problems. Caterpillar won the highway truck engine market for decades. But when the conditions changed, when the regulatory environment shifted, when the cost of staying competitive exceeded what the returns could justify, they chose to take their engineering talent somewhere else. The engines they left behind are still out there, turning miles on trucks that their drivers maintain with unusual care. The sound of a pre-emissions Cat diesel is still one of the most recognizable sounds in trucking, and it still turns heads at truck shows and rest stops in a way that newer, cleaner, quieter engines simply do not. Some things in this industry are not just about efficiency and compliance and total cost of ownership. Some things are about the sound of a machine doing exactly what it was built to do, with a character that cannot be engineered by committee or replicated by a successor. The Cat truck engine was one of those things, and the fact that it is gone makes it, in the way that lost things always are, a little more valuable than it ever was when it was everywhere. Which Cat engine do you think was the greatest of all time? Drop it in the comments below. We genuinely want to know. Thanks for watching, Titan Haulers, and remember to subscribe for much more.